Oh, man, yeah. Okay, thank you. It is 2:00, so I'd like to begin. I'd first like to say thank you to everyone for attending our second special Waterfront Stewardship Committee meeting today, Thursday, May 18. I'd also like to acknowledge with respect that we are meeting on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, and we are honored to have the opportunity to build strong working relationships with the people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. Just to do a roll call here, it looks like we do have quorum today. Neve, Ryan sends her regrets, as well Sean Molchanok is also not in attendance today. So I'd like to call the meeting to order. It is 2:01, and I'd like to start with approval of the agenda. If I can get a motion, a recommendation that the agenda of the special Waterfront Stewardship Committee meeting of May 18, 2023 be adopted as presented. Great. Thank you, Sarah Gibbons. Any discussion? Nope. Okay, motion carried. Thank you. I did. Thank you for checking. Item number 3 on the agenda is an adoption. So a motion, recommendation that the minutes of the Waterfront Stewardship Committee meeting held April 27, 2023 be adopted as presented. Can I get a motion? Thank you, Mr. McKay. Any discussion? No discussion? Okay, great. Thank you. Motion carried. Item 4, public participation. Do we have anyone signed on for public participation? Nobody for today. Okay. So we'll move on to item number 5 on the agenda is new business. 5.1 Colwood Waterfront Stewardship Plan Detailed Engineering Analysis. We have 3 presenters today. Ian Borhill, Tyler Pettipiece, and then we have David Ford, who will be presenting virtually today. So I will pass it over to Mr. Borhill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm here today to introduce with Tyler as the 2 leads on this project on the staff side, engineering report prepared by Associate Engineering, which will be spoken to directly by our lead consultant, David Ford. So this report that's coming before the committee is simply provided for information. And we think that this meeting is going to be best spent on questions and answers as it relates to the information the engineering report contains. It was developed in response to a request made by Council on May 9th, 2022. I'll read the resolution as follows. That staff work with the Waterfront Improvement Plan consultants to provide an estimate of reserve funds required for repairs to the waterfront improvements due to the storms and to determine how often they may occur. And secondly, that the design and construction methods of the waterfront improvements be optimized to minimize damage and cost of repairs. So we're quite pleased that these 2 requests have been, we think, well addressed through the detailed engineering analysis that we're presenting today. And as I said, David Ford is available now to present, and Tyler and myself will be available also to answer any questions. So with that, Madam Chair, we could provide the floor to Mr. Ford.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, and with that, I'll try and share my screen. Hopefully everything goes to plan. So hopefully everybody can see that on screen there. So yeah, thanks Ian, and thank you to the committee. So yeah, as Ian teed up, this is just going to be kind of a brief overview of the technical work that was done in the last 6 to 9 months with regard to optimizing the Colwood Waterfront Stewardship Plan to essentially limit wave overtopping damage. So we'll be talking a lot about wave overtopping in this meeting. I represent Associated Engineering. I'm a senior water resources engineer based in the Vancouver office. and we worked together with our project partners, DHI, to develop this, and Jessica Wilson and Danker Coline were the primary engineering staff from DHI involved. And before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the help and input of Mr. Paul de Grief, who was one of the primary authors of the Colwood Waterfront Stewardship Plan that was presented to yourselves last year. So just wanted to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the unceded territory of Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam nations. We acknowledge all the Indigenous people who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside and work on. So what is wave overtopping? This video probably kind of shows a good example. It's essentially when waves run up a beach profile or a coastal profile and can overtop the coastline and inundate the area behind it, and can lead to damage. In this case, lead to damage of your intended multi-use pathway or trail and any other infrastructure that sits on Colwood's waterfront and on Cobourg Peninsula. So the project scope was, we completed a site reconnaissance last summer. We did a technical review of the Waterfront Stewardship Plan concepts, so the elements involved in the plan. Then we did a detailed wave overtopping analysis, which was basically evaluating the amount of overtopping in terms of volume per second per meter. And then on the back of that, making recommendations for technical amendments to the design. We have completed a discussion of anticipated O&M costs for the proposed infrastructure. We also undertook a coastal flooding assessment of Ocean Boulevard Sanitary Lift Station, and then we've completed all of the relevant reporting and speaking to yourselves now as well. To put it simply, the project objective was to refine the eventual waterfront stewardship plan elevation and dimensions to limit damage due to wave overtopping, but also to keep members of the public safe as well, and users as much as possible. So the wave overtopping analysis consisted of these 7 steps. So we did our technical review of the waterfront stewardship plan concept. That was the original report and conceptual drawings produced by Paul de Grief and presented to the city previously. Then we looked at what were the environmental drivers influencing resulting overtopping. We then took cross sections through the shoreline, Colwood shoreline, and fancy name for that is just transects, coastal transects through the shoreline. We then characterized each shoreline or each transect in terms of whether it was nice, gently sloping beach or whether it was a rocky foreshore, as an example. We then estimated existing overtopping rates, so how much wave overtopping is experienced by Colwood's waterfront at present. And then we determined future crest elevation, so future shoreline elevations, so that wave overtopping would be limited to safe limits to limit any potential damage or public safety concerns. And then finally, we made recommendations for technical amendments to the waterfront stewardship plan. And the image on the right essentially is kind of a graphical depiction of what was done. We looked at water levels, wave conditions, sea level rise, looked at the cross sections through the existing shoreline as well as the waterfront stewardship plan, and did our math, did our scientific analyses to come up with our wave overtopping, and eventually that led to our reporting. In terms of the technical review, we kept to the same terminology and geographic breakdown. of the original Waterfront Stewardship Plan. So in Coburg North, right at the very tip of Coburg Peninsula, the D&D property future is unknown, I think, still at present. I believe there's a plan to revert that, or if it hasn't been done already, revert it into the city's hands. There is a spatial constraint for dune restoration expansion at the north end. The Riflery berm crossing area, there's a similar spatial constraint. And at South Beach, there is no major concerns. In Milburn, the area north of the existing sanitary lift station needs to be raised. Essentially, the ground needs to be raised to prevent flooding. The proposed wave plaza and beach access would need to move north for a similar reason. And there is a spatial constraint for raising the south end of Ocean Boulevard and creating the proposed beach scallops. And that's roughly coincident with the existing property entrance at the end of Ocean Boulevard. And in Perimeter Park, because of the Aloha slopes and the nature of the proposed works under the Waterfront Stewardship Plan, a detailed geotechnical and geomorphological analysis may be needed. So getting a little bit into the weeds, a little bit more on the technical side, we assigned a design life for the Waterfront Stewardship Plan of 50 years. And that was assigned in concert with communications with city staff. It was determined that an appropriate design event, so the level of service, let's say, would be a 100-year or 1% AEP storm, which leads to an encounter probability of 39%. So essentially, there's a 39% chance of that event being encountered during the design life of the works. And the graph or the chart at the bottom is just a fancy way of representing how a specific return period interacts with the design life of any intended works. So the further you move out in terms of return period, so let's say a 200-year event, obviously the chances of it occurring in the short term are very low. But as you move towards the extreme right of this table, the odds of encountering it increase. Water levels and waves came from an existing study that AE and DHI completed a couple of years previously for the entire capital region, and just colloquially known as the CRD study. And that work encompassed the city of Colwood, but also all the municipalities and electoral areas and regional districts within the capital region, as well as participating First Nations. And the kind of design tide level, still water level, plus surge was 1.99 meters geodetic to CGVD 2030. So that's for the 100-year still water level or 100-year blue water flood level. And then we applied a sea level rise factor on top of that, or a sea level rise adjustment. And they came from recently published Natural Resources Canada projections. And in this graph, it's basically the solid black line that we've used, which is the median, the RCP 8.5 median value. The blue line is actually the old provincial guidelines, or the existing provincial guidelines. Step 3 then was we divided the shoreline up into 17 transects, or 17 cross sections. And those sections were chosen as indicative examples of surrounding shoreline and beach areas. And then we had our wave modeling from our previous 2021 study. And at each transect, we exported the wave modeling results. And that's basically a significant wave height value. It's basically a wave height for our design event. that then gets applied to the shoreline, to the cross section, and we're able to calculate the resulting wave overtopping rate for that event. We then took a look at each cross section, and we produced sketches at each cross section, at each transect, and we cross-referenced those against the existing Waterfront Stewardship Plan drawings, and we had a look with respect to what structures were being proposed. So in our reporting, you'll see kind of these big 11 by 17 sheets in the appendices that break down each transect and where they sit and what's being proposed with regard to the Waterfront Stewardship Plan. So once you run the math and once you run the formulae for the design event, which is a 100-year storm occurring with a 50-year design life, as well as a sea level rise being applied. This is for the rates shown here actually is for no sea level rise. The existing shoreline, you can see that we're getting significant wave overtopping in some areas on Colwood Peninsula. And how those wave overtopping rates are defined, it's there's a publication called Eurotop, which is an industry standard reference material with respect to safe wave overtopping rates for various purposes. So for example, if the peninsula was being trafficked, then driving at low speed, the second entry in that table, we would be trying to limit mean wave overtopping to 10 to 50 liters per meter per second. But you can see that many of the instances on the table on the left exceed that number. With regard to damage to structures and property, we want to keep overtopping rates much lower, in some instances as low as 1 liter per second per meter or less. So we had basically a picture of what happens right now with respect to existing elevations, existing shoreline slope and profile. And then we had a chat or communications with the city to decide what were appropriate limits to set as standards for the design of the Waterfront Stewardship Plan. So we decided or landed on rates as shown on this particular table. So we said anywhere where there would be very sensitive infrastructure, we would limit it to 1 liter per meter per second. So that's affecting the sanitary lift station. In any area where there would be pedestrians present, but it would be difficult to close off, we said that it would be 10 liters per meter per second. We understand that under existing storm event conditions, the city is able to close off or isolate areas of Colwood Peninsula. So the likelihood of members of the public being in vulnerable areas during storm events is low. And then in other areas where more wave overtopping could be tolerated, where the entirety of Colwood Peninsula could potentially closed off. So up at the north end, we said that a higher wave overtopping limit could be tolerated. That's the 20 liters per meter per second. And all of those values, again, come from the Eurotop manual, which is the industry standard with regard to wave overtopping analysis. And once you set these proposed overtopping limits as thresholds, it essentially creates an artificial bench or an artificial elevation that the profile or the cross section through the shoreline needs to increase to. And I'll show you an example of that in a second on one of the images. But it always means, or if we need to meet that particular standard, then we have to increase the height of essentially the shoreline at that location, as well as lengthen the shoreline profile. So some of the limitations of the approach, sure you guys have the slides and it's contained within the report, but a couple of the big limitations would be that This is for coastal storms only. It does not take into account any overtopping or performance when subjected to tsunami flooding. It doesn't take into account any mobilization of logs. And I know that that can be an issue during some storm events or during a lot of storm events, but it's very hard to quantify. Again, shoreline slopes and structures are highly schematized. So the analysis is a good surrogate, but obviously at very site-specific locations, the results may deviate somewhat. And the recommended crest elevations are not flood construction levels as defined by the BC provincial guidelines and the flood hazard land use management guidelines. So they're not meant to inform habitable structures or structures of any kind. So this basically this is the end product of the analysis. So we're determining the future crest elevation, and ultimately that leads to shifting the design elevation and position of the multi-use trail, as well as the other Waterfront Stewardship Plan infrastructure elements to accommodate that wave overtopping limit. If we don't shift the position of the proposed Waterfront Stewardship Plan infrastructure, then it will lead to increased wave overtopping over the lifetime of the project, and it will lead to damage of any constructed elements, leading to higher and more frequent O&M costs, and will lead to higher exposure of members of the public who may be there during storm events inadvertently, and also any city staff or emergency staff that would be out there monitoring the peninsula during storm events. The next couple of slides are just very specific recommendations for amendments to the Waterfront Stewardship Plan. It's a lot of text, a lot of information, and again, I would refer you guys to have a read of the report, kind of digest it properly, as well as have a look at the accompanying graphics in those 11 by 17 appendices. But we'll go through a couple of them. With regard to at the very southern end of the proposed Waterfront Stewardship Plan project, there's a waterfront plaza and a raised boardwalk proposed in Perimeter Park. Essentially, we would be proposing that that waterfront node be shifted seaward, because we would prefer to reduce the plaza elevation and the material fill requirements. As well as that, we would be proposing that additional studies need to be done. So that's the geomorphological assessment, as well as geotechnical assessment for stability of the slope and the potential for any scouring and wave impact loading to the boardwalk as a result of exposure to waves and their impact. That has not been done at this point due to the conceptual nature of the project. Moving northward towards Milburn, the existing riprap slope is in informally poor condition, and that if the city wanted to maintain that road long term, then it would be a good idea for that riprap to be backed by a wave protection wall, so that erosion of that road doesn't occur, overtopping of that road doesn't occur over the lifetime of the project. Similarly, to accommodate the Woonorth, you will need additional space to essentially provide a stable beach grade to make that beach profile shallower and to reduce wave overtopping and wave erosion potential. With regard to the lift station, there is an appendix in our accompanying report that looks at the long-term viability and feasibility of the sanitary lift station. Generally, our findings were that at present it looks like the lift station is safe behind the informal riprap protection and lock block wall that was completed in the last couple of years. But the city should adopt an adaptive management and monitoring approach to keep an eye and see how things go and revisit that analysis every few years as our understanding of sea level rise and its rate of increase deepens in the next couple of years. The wave plaza would preferably be moved northwards. The reason for that is that the existing ground there is quite low, actually lower than blue water flooding, which is the potential still water level. So that's just the extreme tide plus a storm surge. And that could actually lead to water inundating the wave plaza and moving southwest towards the lift station and essentially creating an island of the lift station. So ideally that ground would be raised slightly to be above the still water level elevation to cut that route off. The primary takeaway for the rest of the peninsula is that additional space is required to accommodate a stable upper beach. So essentially everything needs to move slightly inland, and the proposed dune restoration would need an increased elevation, much more, not much more, but higher than what's there at present to meet that safe wave overtopping threshold limits. And finally, at the D&D lands, the dune layout will require the removal of the existing riprap material that sits there and regrading of the upper beach profile. And then the last slide, and we go into more detail in the reporting with respect to costing. In the original Waterfront Stewardship Plan report, costs were provided with regard to capital, as well as including contingency for engineering, essentially detailed design services, and a 5% contingency. Our recommended amendments were costed based on the same unit rates. So that's what the second row is. And then we also beefed up the contingency costing as well. And that's what the last column is, to account for the significant volatility that we've seen in engineering projects over the last 2 years, all the inflationary knock-on effects. And then just to note that the current Waterfront Multi-Use Pathway project is a subcomponent of the overall CWSP project. So with that, thank you, and pass it over for any questions.
Thank you for that presentation, David. Certainly a lot of information in those reports and in the draft. So this is an excellent opportunity for the committee to ask any questions for clarity. So I'd like to open the table now for questions, if you have any.
David, in this report, they refer to working around and changing the blocks in front of the Suez lift station, taking one layer off and moving them elsewhere. And they're talking about moving things south where that berm is. My question is that I'm under the impression that that berm to the south has got Aboriginal remains. And I don't think we can touch it, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know how we can do that. Secondly, I don't know, maybe I'm jumping to conclusions here, but the actual lift station itself, I know it's got a longer lifespan, but there's issues with that from an operational point of view that I have concerns with, and that is the air intakes that are on the seaward side, and the diesel exhaust is on the seaward side. Coming from that background, it's the wrong place for an air intake in case a wave comes through. there's ways you can mitigate that, but it's wide open. And the diesel engine, if that generator goes down on an event of a power failure, we're in trouble. And so there's a number of issues around the lift station from an operational point of view. But I guess there's the other thing about the blocks and the berm moving south, if it's Aboriginal remains, and what have you.
So the first part to your question, our finding was that the berm, and as it meshes into the lock block wall and riprap at the south end of the lift station, is high enough and performs a function to protect the lift station from existing wave overtopping. So from our project perspective, the DHI perspective, we wouldn't be proposing to do anything to that berm or that lock block riprap, because it's performing that protective function in terms of limiting wave overtopping and damage to the lift station. The only change we would be recommending is to raise the existing ground on the north end, just outside the actual entrance to the public washrooms, to get that above the 2.99 meter contour, I think is the level. On the second part of your question, I didn't take a specific look when we were looking at the sanitary lift station on things as sophisticated as like the intakes, because it wasn't we weren't looking at it in terms of like the minutia of the operational concern for the lift station. It was more like, is there a catastrophic risk in terms of a lot of equipment being underwater, the electrical stuff being underwater, and from that perspective, things seem to be okay. But if there's specific points of the system that need to be rearranged or relocated, that's something that I can take offline with city staff if required.
Yeah, my question pertains to the contingency. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that contingency in terms of how you arrived at that 40% and what the major components were.
Mm-hmm. So the 40% is an industry standard Class C, Class D contingency value, and that comes directly from guidance that's given to us by EGBC as well as ACEC. Because it's a conceptual, the project is at conceptual level design, there's still quite a lot of cost variability and uncertainty in the cost assumptions. And until detailed design is completed and a very detailed opinion of probable cost is produced, we felt it appropriate to apply a 40% contingency because of the level at which the design is at.
Okay, so basically that was predicated by the, I guess, subsurface conditions or the geotechnical concerns?
Exactly. So down at Perimeter Park, the significant uncertainty would be the geotechnical conditions. There would also be uncertainty with regard to the geomorphological aspects of the beach and how sediment moves along the beach. There's also the very real concern with the volatility of suppliers and how much is a cubic meter of gravel, how much is a meter squared of asphalt. And we've seen some very wild variability in that construction pricing, unfortunately, locally in the last 2 years.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
Hi, David. In the report on table, I think it's 5.1, you list quite a few potential environmental impacts as a result of the suggestions for changes in height and such like. I've got kind of two questions about that, really. I mean, I know you're not necessarily an ecologist, but I wonder if you have a feeling for how much of those impacts would arise anyway due to the increases in sea level and wave overtopping, and also to what extent they could be mitigated by specific solutions to raise the height that would actually increase habitat as a result of the work being undertaken.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the information contained in table 5.1 is essentially if no one in the regulating authorities did us a solid, I think. I think the nature of the project, because it's so green infrastructure based, it's so environmentally friendly, that there may be an ability to have permitting light, let's say, or to work with the permitters and regulators from an early point in the detailed design cycle, that some of that would actually, we'd be seeing benefits, as you said, by increasing habitat because we're increasing dune height or increasing dune footprint. But you're right that those permits and those considerations would have to be considered regardless of the recommendations we made in our report or not, because of the potential for works. And one of the guiding principles when we were looking at these amendments was to refrain from, as much as possible, ingressing into the foreshore and taking up more beach than we needed, because that's far more difficult to justify and to achieve than to extend inland. So essentially any movement in the footprint was inland, and you'll see that from the sketches and the appendices.
David, I don't know if I'm jumping the gun or that is design criteria coming later, but the north end of the lagoon, is there any thought to prevent erosion by installing a groin? The Sea Bulk report recommended either a number of groins or a couple of groins, but the one they definitely recommend, I think it was recommendation 6, was to put a groin where the existing spit is. Now, in my opinion, the riprap that was surrounding the house kind of bunged things up, because the natural breakwater created from when we had a spit was gone. So that erosion came through and it was in conflict with the bridge, with the footings, which we experienced that in 2010, I believe. Would not a groin do a number of things? It would capture the sand, like it's the classic example of that is in Ball Bay, where you were. Ross Bay, pardon me, stand corrected, Ross Bay, where they got a series of them. Well, we're talking one here, and it possibly could serve a multitude of purposes, one of which would act like a barrier as a breakwater to protect the footings of the bridge. So we wouldn't have those waves come rolling in as we did in 2010. And because before, when we had that feedstock coming from the producer's pit, it produced a natural breakwater, and it protected the bridge footings and did a number of things. But now that that's gone, it's creating nothing but issues, and the original stream, or the way it was a number of years ago, is gone. It's like a meandering tidal stream that comes out there. So I'm just asking the question about groins. Thank you.
Yeah. So I would say the issue of groins were outside the remit of our project, but just as an aside, we did take a high level look at all of those reports, and you're right in that the lack of that initial or the original feedstock from the quarry or from the pit means that that sediment supply is dried up and the beach is reverting kind of to its natural condition and is moving that fine sediment, rolling it up the end of the peninsula. A groin would obviously help capture that sediment, whether or not it would perform a protective function of the bridge foundation or the bridge abutments. That would have to be looked at in careful detail. But again, that's kind of consideration was outside the scope of this project. But again, happy to discuss same with city staff as required.
Does anybody have any other questions? Oh, Mr. Willing.
Yes, David, further to Rick's suggestions here. I believe that you laid out that removal of the riprap berm along the face of where the original pub was to be considered. And in terms of cost, to take that berm and move it, say 150 or 200 meters to the north, on the chance that that groin would work, would save an awful lot of money in any project like that, because there's very little movement of material. Otherwise, you've got a truck probably, I don't know what, there's 8,000 or 10,000 tons of riprap out of there and put it somewhere else. But my fear is that you take that groin out of there, or the riprap out of there where it exists right now, and I think it opens a sensitivity to that north abutment of the bridge where we've had that trouble before. And there is a base in there already. If you see it at low tide, you'll see that there's a base that was put in by a former Colwood council, and it extended probably close to 150 meters from where the fence was for the pub. And I think that the base is already there. All you have to do is take the riprap and put it on top of it, and then see where it goes. But I'm really nervous that taking that out of there and not replacing it with something is going to open that whole north corner of the bridge to a full onslaught of southeasterlies.
So one of the recommendations in the report to help determine that would be a detailed geomorphological study, essentially a sediment transport model, this forecast to see how that material would interact with storms, both kind of run-of-the-mill storms as well as the upper scale of those. One of the benefits with regard to removing that riprap and trying to create a more naturalized dune system there is that it's an offsetting habitat gain. So it would be a very positive habitat and environmental win. But I completely hear your point with respect to keeping the abutment of the bridge, of course, protected.
And my other point would be in 1965, that the gut in between Fisgard Light and the foreshore of the shore was established. And that created a change in how the fine granular material coming out of Millstream Creek and the Esquimalt Harbor changed dramatically after that point in time. But right now, this is changing faster than I've seen in the last 20 years, is the return of that spit that's heading from Fisgard Light going south. It's changed things dramatically. And as Rick said, it's changed the flow of the stream course that comes out of there at low tide.
Yeah, with the danger of it closing off Esquimalt Lagoon. Is that your danger or your perceived danger? What you think?
No. It's just that was another circumstance that has changed, that possibly this will not be going back to its natural state. That never was a natural state because they removed the natural flow between Fisgard and the headland.
In conjunction with what Glenn was saying, David, the last 20 years, it's been astounding of the change in the whole layout, if you want to call it, from the delta of the stream coming out of the tidal stream coming out of the lagoon. For instance, the north side on Fort Rod hillside, there was never that amount of sand and beach that was there. That didn't exist. It was a very, very, I'm going to say, maybe 5-10 yards of a beach. Now you look at it, it's astounding how much that's changed. And I'm going to say that a lot of that is due to the fact that the feedstock is gone, and the natural recurve spit that was there is now gone. So much so that up until the 1940s, before D&D took over in the Second World War, if you look on aerial photographs in 1937, there's houses, there's like cabins all the way along there, from the pub out towards the recurved spit of what used to be there. And that was the natural breakwater that protected the bridge. And that's gone. Consequently, in the last 20 years, the configuration has changed dramatically, with the sand, the sand shifting to the north towards Fort Rod Hill, and even out further to the further. So the natural configuration, what I'm saying, is gone, and now we're left with what we've got, which is eerily, if you look at a drawings from 1947 from a hydrographic survey done by the Royal Navy, the whole layout of the lagoon looks eerily similar to what we have right now.
Yeah, as I said, the beauty of the geomorphological modeling, hopefully, as the project progresses, is that we would be able to forecast potential changes based on current coastal conditions and potential future conditions, as well as you could simulate any potential mitigative measures or any changes, any measures that could change the regime there locally. So yeah, hopefully that's something that could be explored.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Those are all really great questions. Just wanted to give everybody another opportunity if you had any questions. Mr. Borhill, will the committee have an opportunity to speak to this draft plan prior to it going for final endorsement?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our intention is to bring the draft waterfront stewardship plan to council with the recommended changes that are included in the associate engineering report. We are going to be asking for an opportunity to bring it forward to the public, stakeholders, and partners. And that's our plan at this point. It would be ultimately council's decision what role the committee has in that process of getting final input on the draft. But we are looking forward to this committee serving as essentially the steering body for implementation of it moving forward.
Great, thank you, Mr. Borhill. So I'll just give the floor another opportunity for any questions or comments that you have for any of our presenters or staff today. No? Okay. Well, then if I can get a motion to adjourn the meeting. Thank you. And okay, we're done for the day. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to staff for being here today.
Thanks, everybody.